Everyone, just want to do a really quick recap of our lesson last night as we're in this series, The Mission of God, and learning about what our part is in the mission of God and what that looks like. And so last week we answered why we're here. Why does humanity even exist? And we ultimately came to the biblical conclusion that we exist for the hallowing of God's name, for the glory of God, and to know Him and to worship Him with our lives. That's why every single human was born or created. That's why humanity was originally created in the first place. And the second question that we looked at this week is, so where do I go? Where do I go to do this? And the immediate answer that we learn from the story of Esther is we're right here. We're supposed to go right here in Lancaster County in 2021. This is the historical, cultural context we've been placed in that God has determined for us to live. And so this is where we go right now. And we looked at the story of Esther, and there were 4 things that we learned that I think kind of help us answer this question and figuring this out. The first is, in the story of Esther, we see the sovereign hand of God moving throughout that entire story. What's interesting about the story of Esther is that we never see or hear the name of God mentioned once in the entire story, which is kind of interesting to think about that. But we do see in the events and the details that take place, God sovereignly moving and working despite us maybe not being able to see it so evidently. And so that's important for this question. We'll get to that in a moment. And the second thing that we saw was the humble service of Esther and Mordecai. We saw them humbly serve and submit to the requests of the others. And it's when we humbly submit and serve that we actually get a vision for going and understand where we're supposed to go and what that looks like. And then the third thing is obedience. Sometimes obedience is costly. Sometimes it can be dangerous. Obedience is going to cost your time. It's going to cost resources, and it could cost you your life. As we know, it was very dangerous for Esther to intervene on behalf of the Jewish people when they were facing death and destruction. All right. So obedience is not always going to be easy and convenient. And then the fourth thing is we learn from the villain sort of in the story of Haman, we learn that our pride destroys us, and our pride is what keeps us from going. And so understanding God's sovereignty, humble service, faithful obedience, even in difficulty, when it's difficult to do, even when you might even be facing certain death, and our pride, understanding that our pride prevents us from going, are 2 things that we've got to grasp and understand if we are to go as God has called us to. And to answer the question twofold, right now, God has called us here to Lancaster. In the future, here's a prayer that we encourage the teens to pray and be willing to pray. Could be a difficult prayer to pray and scary even, but to pray this prayer, God, I'm willing to go. Where do you want me to go? God, I am willing to go wherever it is. Show me where you want me to go. That's a prayer that we all need to ask ourselves. It's a prayer that my wife and I have prayed when we were first here at Grace Church, and when we continue to pray and pray that, not that necessarily God's going to give us a clear dream or vision, but that He's going to be faithful to those who will humbly submit and faithfully obey the call to go wherever that may be. So would you, just with your teens, we encourage you to pray that prayer together. Parents, I know it can be difficult to pray that and be willing to let your teens go wherever God might call them, because that could be scary. You might end up being far away from them. That can be difficult. But as we learn from the story of Esther, God uses ordinary people, ordinary circumstances to proclaim His gospel and to bring glory to Himself. And so I pray that as a family, you'll take some time thinking over these things and even being willing to pray these things together.